I'm starting with a new file of the scene, Forced A06, and I made just a couple of changes to the material, just little tweaks here and there. But there is one primary change I had made, and that is modifying the map for the path and the dirt path. And what I did was replace the link with an edited version of the material. Going to the Links tab, World Browser, right-click, replace link, and then I chose the modified version I created, which I just applied a little effect in Photoshop on and thinned it out just a little bit, so really didn't spend much time editing it. The biggest change was to the scale, so it's now 4096. However, the terrain is still 1024, so if we edit the terrain, what's going to happen is it's going to ask if we want to downgrade the material or the image in order to match the terrain, and I'm going to say no. I'm not going to be using the painter for this material layer, so I don't need to worry about being able to see it, and I do not want to change the resolution because I want the higher resolution, and we kind of need it because we have such a small area that we're working with. So now, just to keep that in mind, so once the terrain is edited, you don't want to resample the image. I did make one additional modified image for the material, and this is going to be for that dirt layer and the dirt path. We'll go ahead and rename that dirt path, and also change the name of the overall terrain material to landscape. So in dirt path, I want to edit the function using any of the previews, and what I want to do is modify the bump. So what I'm going to do is add in a texture map, so we can click to just get that red layer. You can also right click to open up all of the different texture maps or texture map nodes. So you can either go on the left and just add the generic texture map node and then change it from there, or you can right click texture map node and then specify which one you want. I'm going to use the unscaled projected texture map. Now what this does, the unscaled version, is it restricts or keeps the texture map linked to the size of the object, like a parametric type of mapping mode. So no matter what scale the material is, the image map will remain linked to the scale of the terrain or the scale of the object. So I'm going to go ahead and load in the lower left here, we have the ability to load an image. And I'm going to, instead of choosing from my collections, and right now I've got the leaves collection open, the asileFX leaves collection, I'm going to go ahead to the lower right here and browse for a file. So here is the edited version, which is a bump. I'm going to override the gamma, which this just allows you to do that ahead of time rather than selecting that Y icon. You'll see that it is overridden already. So this is going to be a modified bump layer. And we just want to match the mapping mode to the other map. And anytime you're going to modify bump with an image, you want to use an interpolation type to smooth out the image. And in this case, since we have such a, even still a small image for the size of the terrain, I'm going to set it to bilinear. And then we're going to select the link to this blender, this final output, add in another blender, or a combiner node over here on the left. And then there's this top link, which is input 1, input 0 being connected to the other blender. We're going to connect it to the grayscale output of the unscaled project texture map and add a value of 0.1. So we're just adding the texture map a little bit. You also notice it is connected to the displacement output. And what we can do is just select that link, clicking and holding down and dragging that to that blender. So in case we do displace it, it's also going to have the same output. So let's go ahead and take a look at the current setup. Now this is way too intense. The output of the bump is 1.5, which isn't all that high, but the scale or the output from texture maps is much higher than it is from fractals and noises. So we are going to change this add to 0.01 and really reduce the addition onto the bump map, which should just give us a small little bump around the edge of the pathway. It shouldn't be that large of a change. You should just be able to see it showing up a little bit closer. So now you can see just how the path dips in just a little bit, because all this image is an outline. So I just kind of outlined the path, and that goes all the way up through. Not a huge change. I might even need to actually, now that I look at it, invert the image, because it is going the wrong way. So going back into the material in the texture map, selecting the node for that new material, which we can give it a name if we want to call it edge. I'm going to invert it. And now it raises it up a little bit better. So it's not really showing very well on the edge of the path, and that might be because of the alpha and the fact that the alpha is cutting out where that part is located. But just to make sure, what I'm going to do is go back to the material and turn off Mipmapping. What Mipmapping does, if you haven't worked with any other 3D application before, Mipmapping is the scaling down of images in relation to the camera distance. So as the camera moves farther away from a surface, the texture map is automatically downsized and resampled. And that way you don't have an oversized map throughout, and it does make things run a little bit better. I still don't really see it all that well. I think the alpha is kind of cutting it out. But that should be okay. It just adds a little bit of extra detail. It might need to tone down that addition a little bit more, because you can see it is really, really intense, and texture maps always output a very high value. The lighting is another thing to keep in mind. Because of the position of the sun right now, it's more than likely just not allowing any shadows or diffusion to really show on that image map. So modifying the position of the sun could also make that really come out a little bit more. So if we hit F4 on the keyboard or go up to Atmosphere Editor, we can adjust the sunlight, the azimuth, or the pitch. Pitch is the up and down from the horizon to the midpoint of the sky, and the azimuth is the rotation around the scene. So we're going to modify this to 216 for the azimuth, and let's go ahead and do 30 for the pitch. So it's still not showing up a great deal, but that should be okay. We might see it a little bit later. I can start to see it show up on the path further away, but because that's so much farther away from where the camera is located, I'm not really going to worry about the detail on it. So now we're going to start with the ecosystem, and we're going to start out with the larger trees and then work our way down to smaller things that will be covering the ground and the smaller plants or twigs, anything like that. I'm going to go ahead and save out a new version of this. And this is going to be B01, and I'm now changing the letter. I like to use the letters in order to signify a major change within the scene. So if I'm working, before we were working a landscape, that's the A's. Now we're moving to the ecosystem, so I'm going to bring that over to the B. So once we start working on B, that's the ecosystem. Once I start modifying the lighting in the atmosphere, that's going to change over to another letter set. And I don't like to save over the same file, just in case if one file becomes corrupted, then you've lost everything. So incremental saves are really nice, and I use them for everything. Another reason I don't incorporate texture maps until the very end. So we're going to be creating a material ecosystem. There are two different types of material, or two different types of ecosystems. There's a painted ecosystem and a material ecosystem. Both have the advantage of using the ecosystem painter, or the Extreme Painter if you're using the integrated version. The main differences are that when you use the main paint ecosystem option, ecosystem painter, up at the top, or the Extreme Painter within the integrated version within the host, it creates a global ecosystem, which is a separate object. It's not tied to any specific material, and it is separate. A material ecosystem is linked to the material itself. And what we're going to do is open up the Advanced Material Editor, and up at the top, select Ecosystem. So using that first layer and then the type, this isn't actually changing the type. If we were to select Mixed Material, it would change the type of the dirt path to a mixed material. But with Ecosystem, it adds an ecosystem layer. You can also see that there is a paint option, because there's nothing in our ecosystem population that's currently grayed out. But you can also paint that way. So what I want to do is add in the list of the trees we're going to use. We're going to start with the larger trees, fill those in, and then work our way down to the smaller elements. So we're going to add in a plant, and we're going to choose from the modified forest trees I created. I'm going to start with some of the larger trees. And what it's going to do is create the different variations and kind of grow them out ahead of time. Also create the OpenGL previews, which is what takes the longest time to load. And the longer, or the higher the polygon count, the larger the image is used to map the leaves and the bark, the longer it'll take to load. So just going through and adding each of the different variations, and I'm going to go ahead and do that so you don't have to sit and watch me load these in. And because I did manage to just crash it, I'm going to just cancel this, reload the scene, and start back at the ecosystem. Okay, I now have all of those plants loaded in, those trees. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go up to the Atmosphere Editor, and under the Wind tab, turn off Enable Wind and Enable Breeze. Because those are going to affect the shaping of the trees, and since I'm not going to be animating this, and even if I did, I don't think I'd really need the wind or breeze. That's something I'd set up a little bit later. So with those off, what I want to do is switch this over to Dynamic Population so that only the trees within the camera's view are being populated. This also takes into account any sort of reflection. So if you have a reflective object that's reflecting something behind you, those trees will also be populated. Dynamic population also works at render time, so it will calculate once it is created. So with animation, it does update, and you can also animate settings over time. If you don't want it to just render, you can also click Preview, which will populate the ecosystem and show it to you. So now what we need to do is figure out or adjust our scales, in order to make some of these trees be the appropriate size. Some of them are a little too small. And also adjust their presence. In other words, how many of them there are. Right now, with the presence of 1 for all of them, they are equally distributed throughout the ecosystem, really depending on their size. If you have a really, really large tree, there's going to be less of those because it's going to fill in the other areas with the smaller plants. So it does sort of have a built-in radius that is used. The Allow Full Quality Near Camera currently is not active for any of these trees. So what we would do is click on the Full Quality Near Camera, but first I want to set up a radius. 150 meters is too much because that's going to bring way too many into view. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up for 25 meters to begin with. And then if you want to view any of these at full resolution, you can just turn on Full Quality Near Camera, and then it'll start to show those objects at full quality. and you'll be able to see their wireframe viewed, or non-wireframe, the shaded view overall. So we can see some of these are also going to show up on the path. And what we want to do is make sure that we're only filling in outside the path. The easy way to do that is to edit the alpha. Before we edit the alpha, I also want to note that the display options will not be available in the integrated version running through the host application. The shaded billboard mode is also not available because the program runs through a different shading mode. If you go to File and Options, I'm using the Shader 4 model. It is set to fixed hardware pipeline anytime you're running it through the host application, and if you're switching between the standalone and the host, it will not revert back, and you will need to change it back to Shader 4 if you do want to use the shaded billboard mode and the advanced lighting features built into the OpenGL. Within the host application, just the standard billboard mode is used. And if we take a look, we can see what that looks like. So just a very undefined view. The shaded billboard uses normal maps in order to give you a better, or more accurate look to the trees. So what we're going to do is use the dirt path alpha that was painted. What we can do is select the alpha, Control C on the keyboard, or go up to the top and copy. Edit the alpha within the ecosystem layer, and we can paste. It looks like maybe I did not copy it correctly. So we'll just use the command and it looks like copy and paste is not working at the moment. But that's alright, because we did save out the image. So what I can do is add a texture map, set it to the unscaled projected texture map, and then load that one in. So using the dirt path edited, override the gamma, connect that to the alpha and the grayscale output. And I might need to invert it. We don't need to use an interpolation type. Let's go ahead and preview it first. It looks like it is just showing on the path. So go back to edit the alpha, invert it. And now this is a feature that is new to version 9. Previously, the only way to really do that is to control a variable density. Also keep in mind, in this case, it still looks like it is showing up in the path. So what we need to do is increase the sampling quality, or edit the map and extend the range. But I'm going to increase the sampling quality to a value of 2, which should use the image map a little better and conform to it. Okay, so now we're going to be modifying the scales. I also want to note that using dynamic population will lower the file size of the scene because it doesn't need to store any population data since it is dynamically created at the time of render. So this preview that we're seeing is not saved with the render or saved with the scene. So dynamic population does free up resources. However, I will note that whenever you use dynamic population, you cannot paint the ecosystem because that is part of a static population. So if we did decide to switch it over, we will need to repopulate and then paint. But I'm going to be using the dynamic population. And what we want to do is start editing the scales. I know some of these I'm going to want less of, so we can also modify presence. But I'm going to start with just kind of taking some of these trees and making them a little bit larger. The alder group is going to be smaller, and I don't have everything loaded in here. And I also created some additional trees as well. I'll just go ahead and try that. And that alder is still, it's right in front. I can tell that's way too small. And some of the trees might be a little too large. But overall, it is starting to look a little bit better. We can also, if I switch over to the top view, you can see how that dynamic population is working, where we have a cone linked just to where the camera view is, and everything behind the camera and to the sides, just a little bit to the sides, because the shadows also need to be taken into account, so that's another thing to keep in mind. It does look like a little bit of a difference between what is showing in the OpenGL and the render, because these don't really have, there's still just a billboard. The actual geometry isn't really there, so I do want everything really close to the camera to show. I'm going to take the radius of the show quality near camera for the overall value, set that to, let's go ahead and set it to 10, and then turn on full quality near camera, so we can see those a little bit better. And we might be able to reduce that a little further. It looks like in some cases the viewing the full quality near camera has removed the display of the billboard. So if needed, I can turn that off, so we can see the other plants a little bit better. It does just look like overall those weren't there, so sometimes it will change the value. I'm going to bump up the radius a little bit more. Go ahead and bring it back to 20. And it might take a second to refresh when you do that, because it does have to load the additional plants. Okay, so now we can see a little bit closer to the camera. What I'm going to do is take that alder and bring the presence to 0.5. We can also double the presence too by going up. So if there's any you want to have more of, we can start to increase presence. So let's take those broadleaf straight trunk modifications or modified versions and set the presence to 1.3 and 1.5. So there's going to be more of those now throughout the scene. And I'm going to go ahead and render this out so we can take a look at the current amount of vegetation. I'll go ahead and make this a little bit larger. Just using the final render mode for now. So the scales do need to be modified a little bit. The trunk of that alder looks terrible. The material is not looking good. I'm just going to reduce the scale of that down to 0.25 and go over to the density and increase the density to 60%, which is going to be the overall filling of the density. Some of these trees are a little too small, and some still too large. So I'm going to take the broadleaf and reduce the 1.5 presence to 1.3. And then my gnarly tree variation that I created, I'm going to bring to 0.4. Now some of these are showing above the terrain, not showing properly. And I may need to modify the width. What I'm going to do is go into the function edit the alpha. And instead of using my modified version of that painted map, I'm going to switch it to the original version, which should be thicker. And we should be able to remove a little bit more around the path. If needed, I can go back and edit it and expand that a little bit further, which I think I'm going to go ahead and do because I don't want the larger trees to be so close to the path. I'm going to want some smaller trees in that area. What I might end up doing as well is removing, for the moment, some of the smaller trees from this population and just assigning those to, or using a different layer, because there's some other controls I want to show you using distribution. So for now, I'm going to remove my maple variation and that alder variation and just work with the larger trees. My gnarly tree variation I think is still too small, so I'm going to bring it up to 0.6. Or let's go ahead and do 0.5. Okay, so I definitely need to modify that texture map because that's just not going to work. Another thing I didn't really realize about the other map, or didn't really think of at the moment, was the fact that it is smaller. So even if it was wider, it might not be taken into account because the pixel size was so small. So now I'm opening my edited version just in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you just how I'm going to make this larger. I'm going to double click on the layer and create a duplicate. Actually, I really don't need to create a duplicate in this case. What I'm going to do is just use the magic wand tool and select within that black area, tolerance set to 5, and I really don't need to worry about refining the edge or anything. I'm going to create a new layer, paint it with black, so switching over to the paint bucket tool or G on the keyboard, click within there, and then M on the keyboard to open the marquee tool and just click once really quickly anywhere to deselect it. Add a new layer, and G on the keyboard or the paint bucket tool, switch over to the white, fill it in, and then selecting that painted layer of the path, double click to open up layer styles, turn on stroke, which by default in CS4 is black, otherwise you can set the color to black yourself. We have it to an outside stroke, so now we can adjust the size for how far away off of the path we want to have the larger trees created. We could also create multiple variations to take care of the smaller trees if needed. So now, once that's done, if you want to save this out to be able to edit it further, to just come back and be able to adjust the style quickly, then you can save an additional version or a PSD file. Otherwise, what we're going to do is just flatten the image, and I am working in the grayscale mode just to make the file sizes smaller, and I'm going to save it as edited eco, save LZW compression, and now going into the alpha, we're going to edit the alpha for the ecosystem and load in the eco layer. And we also need to invert it, preview, and now they'll definitely be off the path. And just before I render this, I am going to turn down the density to, say, 45, because these are just our larger trees. Maybe I'll go ahead and bring it back to 50. I can also turn down the sampling quality to 0. If we need to increase that, a value of 1 should do it, and we'll let that render out. Now, the reason this looks so pixelated is because of the render quality having to do with the texture maps. The leaves on the trees do not have, or at least the transparency for the leaves on the trees doesn't have an interpolation type. So what you're going to see is those harsh edge outlines of the alphas, because they're all two-color, just black and white, not grayscale where you have an in-between fall off on the edge. So it's not going to be smooth. So in order to get rid of that pixelation, you either need to use a soft shadow or camera map, or a shadow map. You can use softness on the sunlight. You could set up softness value. That does take a lot longer to render because it is a ray trace, and then it's going to look really grainy unless you increase the quality boost, which you can access by right-clicking on the sunlight, edit object, and the softness quality will show up. You can see from faster to better once that is set. Any changes made within the light editor, you need to click OK before they will be applied to the scene. If we were to render this with a shadow map, and I'll just go ahead and set that up really quick. You can also go up to the top here. Within the Aspect tab, this bottom box gives you light options. Edit Shadows will take you directly to the Shadows tab. There's a lot of different lighting setups for the lights, volumetric settings, all working differently depending on the light you have. But I'm going to switch this over to Shadow Mapped. Turn the quality to auto size. So use shadow map, and instead of ray traced, shadow map, auto size the quality. And now the ratio setting set to 1 is not going to show small shadows. It's going to be a very dispersed shadow map. So what we can actually do is increase the ratio amount, and ratio is relative to the size of the render. So the larger the ratio, we're increasing the size of the map overall, which will give us smaller shadows, and we'll pick up on finer details. So it does look, definitely looks better now. The bark on the trees, I think, is a little too light. I'm going to darken that up. Another thing is that the amount of ambient light on the dirt path and the dirt is set way too high, and because there isn't a very intense color, anything within shadow isn't going to have a lot of detail. And because anytime we have shadow, we're not really going to see the bump, the color channel becomes even more important. The color channel is really the most important channel of all of the texture maps, because it is the only thing that's really going to show through in all lighting situations. So color becomes definitely the most important. But you can see that most of the pixelation is gone except for the way the overlapping is. So we would need to use anti-aliasing for that. The final render mode and the quality presets, you'll see that texture anti-aliasing is checked off. We can't just turn it on directly. We need to go to either a different mode. If we go to the broadcast mode, texture anti-aliasing is turned on. The only problem with that is that texture smoothing is also used, and we don't want to smooth out anything because it won't look very good for a still. So the other thing we can do is go to User Settings, and we're going to load in with the little arrow Render Quality preset. Within the Environment folder of the View installation, so the environment folder within wherever the actual program is installed, and not the content that's included, but the actual program. In the environment folder, you will find preset render qualities. The View 7 versions are included. If it doesn't have a View 7 next to it, then it is the standard View 8 and View 9 quality. What we can do is load in Broadcast. Click OK to open it up, and then go into Edit the Anti-Aliasing and turn off Texture Filtering, setting it to 0. So now we can see it is definitely looking better. The leaves look vastly better. And if we were to switch over to the Ray Trace mode, it would also improve the look of the shadows. So I want to probably increase the density of this ecosystem a little bit further. So going back to the material density, let's bring it up to 65. It's really filling it in. does look like there's a few trees in here that might be really small. I'm not sure if that's caused by the full quality near camera. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off full quality near camera. Go back and preview it, and just to make sure that that small plant isn't showing. And that was caused by the full quality near camera turned on, which made the billboard smaller. I'm using the pre-release, so hopefully you won't run into that issue. Okay, so just I am going to bring that down to 60. I'm going to turn off the decay near foreign objects because there's really nothing we need to decay from at the moment. And I also want to note, if you want to make modifications to slope range and altitude, if you go over to the Presence tab, we can control exactly where the instances are showing based on altitude and slope. There are a couple of different modes: by object and by material. When you're working in the by object mode, it's very important that if we go into the terrain editor, you want to make sure that the clipping, and that you're clipping out the terrain where it is not being shown. So what you can do is on the bottom, you can clip out the terrain, because this is setting the altitude. We shouldn't need to crop from the bottom, so just cropping from the top, click OK. So now any altitude controls we have are going to be within that clipped range. And otherwise, if I would have left it that way before, the altitude range from 1 to 0 would have been completely null, which reduces the sensitivity and the amount of control we have over the material. So just an important thing to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and save out the scene as BO2. And that way, you can go ahead and load that in to match up to where I'm at. And next we're going to take a look at adding additional ecosystem layers.